Welcome to the Scientist Sage Sangha. We're talking about food tonight in honor of Eating Disorders Awareness Week in Canada. And I've worked in eating disorders for a lot of years and dealt with my own eating disorder for decades. And so this is a topic near and dear to my heart because I don't think people think food and it's not just about recipes. Actually, we're not going to talk recipes tonight. We're going to talk about our relationship to food. And it's interesting because a dictionary definition is that food is any nutrition that we take in and we put into our bodies, which is, an interesting definition, except if you've ever been into the grocery store, you see a lot of canned and boxed things that say nutritious, delicious, things like that. And they're not so nutritious. And so the idea that, just that word can say that that's food, because a lot of the food that we eat is actually not food anymore. It's been broken down. Nutrition has been taken out or added in or masked or distorted. And so a lot of the food that's out there that we think might be nutrition isn't anymore, or it carries other things with it. It's been sort of sensationalized and mechanized and broken down. So a lot of the food that we buy, we don't, it's already been pre-chewed sort of, and we don't even have to chew it to break it down and eat it. And so we get less nutrition that way as well. So that it's a problem. And when it's put back together with lots of formulas and chemicals and things like that and made what's called hyperpalatable. Hyperpalatable is a food that has been treated and with certain formulas to make it hit a particular part of your brain that goes, oh, let me write that down. Whenever I feel bad, I will come back here. I want more of this. And it just doesn't hit that, part of our brain and then mosey on out with, leaving us with no nutrition anyway. That really stays in our brain, that message. So when foods are mechanized and processed, they actually deliver different messages, fake messages, into our real receptors in our body. And those are receptors in our brains and receptors in our guts and other parts of our body, our cells that are looking for things that should be coming in when that hyperpalatable switch gets flipped, but they're not there. So there's fake messages going into our real receptors, and it's just like putting bad data into a computer. It starts to have glitches, and the more bad data you put in, the more glitches it has. And so this is not a feel bad about food you're eating, okay? Because all of us have lots of interesting feelings about food. We're going to talk a little more about that. But literally, that idea of eating food that's less processed is just about getting the real messages we need in our bodies to have our bodies be well. That original definition of what nutrition was, something that is nutritious for our actual bodies. And the saying that let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food, that's attributed to Hippocrates, actually isn't by him, but he has a better saying that I like. He says, in food, excellent medicine can be found. In food, bad medicine can be found. Good and bad are relative. And that is probably the best possible quote. Because if I have an allergy to something and I eat that food, it's bad for me. But if somebody else eats that food and they don't have that allergy to it, it's good for them. And we really, really don't like that definition because that leaves us all on our own little island to figure out what's good for our bodies. And we look to the about 30,000 pieces of diet information that come out a day to find out what we should be eating. And so it's tricky because we're not really taught to talk to our bodies. And literally, it used to be the way of the world, that we would ask higher powers to bless our food and bless our harvests and bless our hunts. And then we sort of moved into like saying grace, at least before a meal. But that evolved away from that, as did everything in the conquer cultures, because the conquer cultures where we have control over everything. We have dominion over everything. So of course we have dominion over planting things and foods, and we can control all of that. And interestingly, there was a food plate presentation, an art show in the San Francisco airport. And I went in there and I saw that, and they were showing dinner plates from the 50s. And the dinner plates were so much smaller than the ones we have now. And I was reading later a article about it. And an editor in a magazine had said, yes, we eat so much food, we need to get back to those plates in this display. And she got hate mail from people about saying, who are you to tell us what we can eat? We can eat whatever we want and do all those things. And so we sort of think about that, and in the way of like, I can rewrite, the reality of metabolism just by what I choose and what I think, what I can dominate that. And unfortunately, a lot of people in our culture try and dominate their own bodies by dieting or getting the perfect diet, particular foods that are just right, and doing that dance over and over. And the reality is we do have to investigate different foods and things that changes literally as people's hormones change, as our lives change, as our needs for energy change, as I recently hurt one of my lower limbs, so I'm not moving around as much. I don't need to eat as much food. I really don't like that reality, but that's just the reality of the relationship with food. My body, if it's not moving around, doing the running around that it likes to do, it just doesn't need as much energy. And it's hard for us to come back there. Food takes this central space in all of our lives. And it literally dictates how we grow, even how we think. The very first brain chemistry group that I ran with people in person at that time, we went through and everybody had brain chemistry assessments and that sort of thing. And then they would choose a food that showed up on their chemistry assessment as something that might not be good for that person. And it was all different, and they weren't unhealthy, heavily processed foods. They were just regular foods that might not work as well for that person's brain, or a food that would help that person's brain. And so the next week they came back, and there was a person that said, I don't know what happened, but everybody at work seems so much nicer this week. And I said, I know what happened. You stopped eating a food that was driving your dopamine over a reasonable level. And so you were not as easily irritated by people at your work. And she didn't quite believe it, but she decided to continue on the experiment of that particular food. And this was a hard cheese that she ate a lot of, and it drove her dopamine up beyond a reasonable level for her brain chemistry. Not true for everybody, for that particular person. But so our food determines how we think. If we don't have enough food, we start to get a little edgy. We've all seen the really bad commercials about that hankering for hunger kind of thing. And the food they feed you to fix that hunger, not so good for your mood either. So this idea about this, we're not really taught a lot about that. We're not encouraged to be in our bodies about it. And nutritional information that we get changes all the time. And there's a wonderful TEDx about a plant-based diet, food be your medicine. And he talks about nutritional information, food information today being advertised in the way that smoking was advertised when it first came out, as helpful to you, as good for you. And it was just so well promoted, and they brought up evidence, and they painted pictures for the public of how good smoking was for you, and they indoctrinated a bunch of doctors and all of that kind of thing. And it's interesting today that so few doctors know about deep nutrition and about individualized nutrition and nutrition for certain illnesses and that kind of thing. As I said, nutrition is the leading killer of people in the USA today. Beyond all the other things, nutritionally based things that could be healed by different kinds of nutrition, those are the main killers. And we can tell you for sure that nutrition is not the primary thing taught in medical schools. They're lucky if they get even a little bit of it. Although I was heartened talking to a young doctor the other day, she actually suggested a nutritional alternative to someone before they went into heavy medicine. So maybe the change is coming. Anyway, in Western society, we've got sort of a love-hate thing going with food a lot of the time. It's sort of a judgmental attitude about it, and it could be on either side of it. Okay, it could be people judging people they think aren't in the exact right body shape or eating foods they don't think they should eat, and people being somehow feeling they're elevated by the way that they eat, and other people should eat in the way that they do. And these things can be really tricky. I had a client that started eating as a vegetarian, and she got really, really sick until she went back to eating some meat. And I've had lots of conversations with people about this, and they're like, no, that if you just do it, and it's like, well, for her, that it wasn't a guided decision. It was a decision that she made to try and fit in with a group of people. And so she hadn't checked in with her body at all. And it's driven by fads, it's driven by trends, by news, by fake news, by diet results. There's so many things that these foods are good for you because they make your body smaller, and smaller at what cost is very different for people. For one person, it might be fine, but for another person, it might be deadly. And so this judgmental attitude and the sort of approach to food that you got to fight it or control it or outsmart it somehow so it metabolizes different in your body. And I do know actually I've heard of a few shamans and holy people that can change that metabolic effect in their body, but I'm not one of them, and I haven't seen a lot of them. But there is some influence we can have on the metabolism of food in our body about the way that we relate to it. And I really encourage people to explore these ideas and explore the idea that it's not right or wrong, but it's either useful for my body or not useful. And it doesn't mean that people can never have one of these, whatever they are that they're afraid of losing. That may be just fine for them. For another person, it may not be, because it may set off that hyperpalatable switch in someone's brain that causes them not to be able to stop eating that. Everybody's brain and body is different. So really talking about that, originally, people actually talk to the plants to get the information about, is this good for me? Should I put this in my body or will it poison me? And that's how we found medicine. That's how we knew what to eat. It was very, people live close to the earth. Of course, if somebody sees you talking to a box of cornflakes in the grocery store, they're probably going to think you're a little crazy. But there is something to it. There's a school of thought called kinesiology and muscle testing. And often if people literally will put the food in their hands, what'll happen is that they can tell their body will feel weak or strong. I did this with a group of junior high kids, and they thought it was great. And this sort of bulky guy comes up and he's like, yeah, it's not going to show me. And I put a chocolate bar in his hand and he put his arm up like you do like this. And I went to press it. He's like, I'm holding it up here. And it just flapped down like a chicken wing. And he was so surprised. And then people start to listen like, oh my goodness. And as I walked out of the school later, the teachers were trying it in the teacher's room. But your body really does tell you what things are good for it and what things are not, and when. I did this chocolate bar experiment in a session I was running on food. and somebody tested strong for it. And I'm like, I've never had this test strong. And so we're trying it. And finally I said, would you be willing to talk to us about what does this chocolate bar mean to you? She had been carrying that chocolate bar around to get herself to not eat those things. And as long as she knew in her mind she could, she didn't need to. And so this particular chocolate bar for this particular person was very good for them. And it was interesting because, like I said, the only time I've ever had that go that way. But that's the power of what are we thinking about our food? How are we relating to our food? And what it might do for us. Okay. Yeah, one of the things about being controlling and angry, and our body just metabolizes differently. When we're really frightened or really angry, or really wound up, the digestive things that we need to break down the foods that go through our body aren't in our stomachs. And so we can get all sorts of gastric distress alone there, but we also don't get the nutrients from the food. Even though they're coming through, they're not getting broken down in a fashion that can feed us. And so lots of times people develop different kinds of eating illnesses, I'll call them, that are very, very emotionally based. And those kinds of things, it's amazing what mindfulness can do. And just noticing emotional states before you eat, noticing the intention about how you feel about the food. Often in mindful eating programs that I've been involved in, we'll have somebody take something into their mouth and try it out. And the iconic one is put a raisin in your mouth and chew it. But what happens for people is that they start to notice that there are changes in their mouths, in their body, in their emotions, and they start to notice what's going on and what's their orientation to food, how they relate to it. So it's really a useful thing to go along and do that, because we aren't taught to merge with our animals or plants or have that sacred relationship with our food anymore. But we can bring that presence to it, which begins to make our food sacred again. And I want to just put up something on the screen for you. Yes, there it is. Okay. And this is really about this idea of food life integration. Okay. And what we see here is that there's a biological point. Absolutely. There is a biological part where we can't get around needing certain nutrients in our food. We need those things from our food. And so that is something we need to do. There has never been somebody that just exists for a long time on like vitamin C that's been isolated by itself. And there is the combination of foods and the way they're put together in actual growing from the ground. And, whether it's an animal or a plant, it's in its natural context. And so we need some of those things for that sort of thing. And for our bodies and our brains need very specific things. In a lot of the low-fat diets, it's very challenging to work with people with anorexia because often their brain is not been getting fat for a long time, and it has a devastating effect on brains to operate in that way. Just like getting fat that's not good fats, and an excess of that is really bad for brains as well. So we're talking about actual bodies and brains, and the health and performance of having energy, being able to do things, all of those things depend on getting that basic biological piece in place. And the psychological part here, the consciousness that we have around food does change how our bodies use it. And that is so important. Often when people are feeling addicted to food, we'll move them through some consciousness, and that is all that it takes to shift that for them. And that's if they don't have a biological trigger that they're exposed to, okay? So it's not for everybody. Again, everybody's a little bit different. But the connection with it and the actual comfort, like enjoying food, Food is a pleasurable thing. It's not meant to just be fuel. It's not meant to have a struggle with. It is an integrated part of our lives, a very natural part of our lives. And we have made it into other things. And the idea about identity and culture too, the kinds of foods we eat, I make a highly, highly processed thing for Christmas dinner every year. And that um, is part of our our family culture. And certain, cultures, every culture has different kinds of food, and that's part of who you are if you grew up in that culture. And you might cook something particularly well, and that's part of your identity. And even as a provider of food, as somebody who cooks it, or, in the older days went out and, gathered it or hunted it. So it's part of our identity with food. It's an absolute part of our lives. It's so integrated if we let it be. And then down to the emotion part. Yeah, food and food food makes us stable. When we have erratic food, we have erratic emotions. And the idea of that is surprising to people. Again, we think we should be able to dominate, control our emotions, regardless of what we put in our body. But we actually have trouble caring for people when we are too hungry or when our bodies are too affected by foods that are not good for us. And the idea of joy and peace, there really is this joy in food if people are really present to it. And if we're present with our food and we're not feeling that, often we're not hitting the mark on what our particular bodies need. And it's not like joy dancing around the room, but it's just this deep body pleasure, like putting the food in our bodies and feeling it and feeling strong. People can actually feel like if you haven't eaten for a while and you finally get something to eat, and you can feel your body circulating all the strength and all the nutrients in your body. And compassion. The whole idea of compassion is when my body is at peace, I am present with other people peacefully. When my body is not okay with food, and whether it's the particular sharp cheddar cheese that drives your dopamine up, or a lack of food when people are trying to restrict their food, the emotional ability to be compassionate with one another starts to disappear. So this is a bedrock of civil society to have good food in our bodies. And the idea of the soul, and people are a little resistant talking about this in terms of food, but literally our food ties us to our planet and to each other. We eat in groups, and that can be a celebration or just community, and it feeds our soul to eat good food. And that is so true. When somebody has gone to an effort to make you food and you're enjoying it with them, it's a soul connection going on. And this idea of paying homage to something, it's just honoring something. And it's a tradition about giving homage for your food. That when they would pick food, they would leave an offering. When they would kill an animal, there would be a prayer of thanks for it. There would be homage to it, be a real honoring of food. And the idea that our body is a temple is a really long-standing idea. But we don't we think of it in almost a embarrassed way or a problematic way, like, oh, I'm not doing good enough in my temple or things like that. But inhabiting our bodies and using food as a blessing and giving our bodies what it needs and listening deeply to it. So those are the kinds of things. It isn't about this is bad and that is good. It's like, where am I on that journey with food? And what kind of consciousness do I have with it? Do I have that higher consciousness that we are on this amazing planet that grows the things we need to put in our bodies so we can grow physically and spiritually and emotionally? And it's amazing how it works together. But when we are fighting with food, we don't see it that way. People see it as, I would rather not eat at all, not have to decide or eat too much or feel like I'm bad for eating this. And so I'm going to invite you guys into just putting down all those ideas and just getting to know yourself and your relationship with food. Your relationship with food is one of the most constant, most important, and most challenging relationships you'll have. And I really encourage you to make it a priority to make that relationship work well for you. Take the time to get to know your food, to get to know your body, what it needs, and work that out. It's not like you can get a separation from food and last very long. So you want to work these things out. You're going to be together a very long time. And what we're going to do now is just take a little moment and just feel in our bodies. And literally, when you think about food, what is the kind of feeling that comes up in your body? Just take a breath and settle into your body. And really just notice. Is your body feeling comfortable? When you think about food, is it a stressful thing for your body? And you might be feeling hungry right now. I didn't eat before I sat down to do this. And so my head is thinking, what are we going to have for dinner when we're done this? And my body is really quite comfortable because I had a piece of fruit earlier. And so I'm not hungry. I'm not overly hungry. I'm fine. And I'm thinking about actually going on a cruise and wondering about what kind of food I'm going to have on that cruise. And I actually am feeling really, it's going to be fun because in cruises, you can ask for certain kinds of food and they will make food to your liking, but they make it really well and they take good care. They take reverence with their food. And so my body had that thought in it as I sat down here with you. So you might find all sorts of thoughts. You might have flashbacks to different times with food. You might have memories of lovely, compassionate things. And lots of people, the smell of cookies or bread or whatever reminds them of home and their mothers and those kinds of events. And you might be in the middle of a struggle with food. Just be compassionate and present. It's not like you have to be any other way than you are. Just being present with these things can guide you to interesting places. And if there's anything that comes up about your guidance with food, I'd encourage you to write it down and maybe sit down and contemplate again. And because this session is for Eating Disorders Week, what I'm going to do is, if you send an email to scientistsage@gmail.com, I have a recording that I made, and it is a morning meditation, and it involves food, but food is not the main part of it. It is about how do I want to be in the world, but also includes food. And it is part of the eating disorder treatment that I used. And I have people that come back to me years after and say, I hear you in my head when I go to eat saying, is this what would be good for my body right now? Do I really want this? And they take a moment and they have a little presence of mind with it. And so if you would like a copy of that audio, you can send that email to scientistsage@gmail.com and I will send it to you. It was too big a file to send out with the email about the Sangha, so I will send them out individually. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and being daring, considering issues around food. I'm with you. You are with me. Listen be.